In the last section, we talked about why it can be important to bracket your exposures. Sometimes, however, bracketing may not be an option. In those cases, you ensure that your important highlight detail is preserved, and you do what you can in Photoshop to fix the shadows. If you do have the option of bracketing, however, it will provide you with a greater flexibility when post-processing. By using your knowledge of zone metering, you can easily calculate the brackets that you may need to make. You can also use zone metering to calculate which split neutral density filter to use. Let me show you how. Here's a typical scene in the late evening when the sunlight is on the distant mountains and I'm in the shadows with the foreground. So what we'll do is we'll look at the foreground and we'll try to calculate the correct exposure for it. And then we'll determine how much of a split neutral density filter we'll need. With the spot meter over the green area here, it's metering about zone 4, which makes sense. Reflections are usually one stop darker than what they're actually reflecting. And we can imagine that this is a nice zone 5. The pine trees over here are zone 4. So that being a 5, our reflection should be zone 4. It makes sense. So we'll just meter around and see what else we come up with. Meter down on the dock, and it goes up to about a 5.5. No problems there. Then you meter over on the sky, and it comes to about zone 5. Well, that's about where it should be. So our foreground is metered correctly. And we have an exposure of 1/8 of a second at f16. When we meter in the sky, however, we notice that we're blowing out. This doesn't come as a surprise to us. But let's see how much we actually have to stop down to get that to where we want it to go. Stopping down to a 15th at f16 puts the sky in zone 6.5. And that's pretty good. It's not a bright white cloud, but it's fairly bright, so that's a good spot for it. Here's the full stop shutter speeds. And we went from 1/8 to 15th, which means one stop difference. So if we were to use a one stop neutral density filter, we should achieve the results that we want. So keeping our exposure at 1/8 at 16, that's good for our foreground. We put on our one-stop neutral density filter and take the shot. And the resulting photograph is just what we're looking for. Let's do another example. Here, we'll start off with the sky first. And we meter the bright white clouds, and we absolutely know we want detail in that area. And that gives us a 1/4 at f22. And then we think, all right, we're probably going to need a split neutral density filter because the shadow area down here is most likely underexposed, but we'll check it out anyway. Put your spot meter down there, and indeed, the hash mark is blinking, letting us know that it is underexposed. So we remember the number 1/4 at 22, and we start opening up to see how much we need to get to bring detail in the area. A 1/2 at 22, it's still blinking. 1 second at 22 provides us with a good zone 3 down in that area. So we went from a 1/4 of a second to 1 second. And when we calculate that out, went from a 1/4 to 1 second, that's a movement of 2 stops. So a 2-stop neutral density filter will do the trick. Return to the image, and again we want to expose 1 second at f22 so that this area is exposed correctly. We know that'll blow out, but the split neutral density filter is going to take care of that. We put that on, and the resulting exposure brings it all together. Here, I began by metering the sky and putting that into the average tone. I came up with an exposure at 60th at f22. When I metered down into the reflection, it was significantly darker. And I want to bring this reflection up. I want it to be brighter. So I'm going to use a split neutral density filter. So let's see how much we have to open up to get this value to where we want it to go. 60th at 16 brightens it up a little bit to a zone 4. and a 60th at 11 brings it to a zone 5. This time I've opened up using my aperture. So let's take a peek at our apertures. What I did was opened up from 22 to f11, and that's 2 stops. So we use a 2-stop neutral density filter again to achieve the results. Now, I'm going to leave this at 60th at 11, so our foreground is exposed correctly, and put on a 2-stop split neutral density filter, and it will darken down the sky. You can also use this same metering technique even if you're not using a split neutral density filter. Many times you might want to blend the images together in Photoshop in post-processing rather than using a split neutral density filter in the field, and that's okay too. It's all the same metering. So here, start in the sky, and we get a 15th at 16, and that puts this area into about a zone 6, which is nice. And when we meter down into the green value, which should be average, we get an exposure of a 1/4 at 16. So going back to our shutter speeds, we see that we've gone from a 15th to an 1/8 to a 1/4. That's 3 stops. So what I would actually do is make 3 exposures, one at a 15th, one at an 1/8, and one at a 1/4. When I return to Photoshop, I've got those 3 exposures, and I'll simply blend them together. Using split neutral density filters is not the only way to achieve good exposure in high contrast situations. Indeed, oftentimes this filter will not work, such as in this image of the church. Here the brightness range far exceeds what our camera can capture in one exposure. The trick then is to take multiple exposures and blend them together in post-processing. There are many ways to do this. One of the coolest is using Photoshop's Merge to HDR function. To use this function to its best ability, you should bracket in full stop increments. So let's see how we would do that. I started by metering the average tone and came up with an exposure of 4 seconds at f11. You could also meter down in here and call it zone 3. Now, because it's church, we want to see the color in the stained glass. But our exposure at 4 seconds at f11 is blowing that out. So we begin to stop down. 2 seconds at f11, the windows are still blown out. 1 second at f11, and we're starting to get detail in there, but not a lot of color. Half of a second at f11 finally provides us with the proper amount of color. So we look to our full stop shutter speeds. And 4 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second, and a half a second. Those are the 4 exposures we'll need to blend together. We take those 4 exposures, bring them into Photoshop, and we'll go from an image that looks like this to an image that looks like this. Full detail throughout the church, plenty of detail in the windows. Now let's move to a more severe situation, the slot canyons of Arizona. Here the contrast is really extreme, so I began by placing the brightest value in zone 6. I wanted it to have some color, not just white, so that gave me an exposure of 2 seconds at f11. Now, there's the rest of the scene. So, placing my meter over a value that I wanted to be neutral or average, I opened up to 4 seconds at f11, and it tells me the value is underexposed. Pure black, no detail. Open up again to 8 seconds at f11, still underexposed. 15 seconds at f11 is just putting that into zone 3, and we're starting to get some color in there. But I want it to be average, so I'm going to keep opening up. 30 seconds at f11 puts it right around zone 4. And finally, 60 seconds at f11 places that value in zone 5. So I know now the range of exposures that I need to make to get detail from the highlights all the way down to the shadows. So I make the exposures at 60 seconds, 30 seconds, 15 seconds, 8, and 4 seconds, and bring them all home. Then I load them up into Photoshop, and I use the HDR function. And it's going to produce a photograph completely impossible before digital imaging. or even before knowing anything about exposure. So, I hope that throughout this video, I have showed you the importance of metering your scenes. Once you get the basics of metering down, it's time to practice recognizing your colors. Begin with the averages. Get to know them by comparing them with your grade card. And make notes to help you figure out what you've done when you get home. If you are taking notes, don't be afraid to bracket. See how exposures can slightly or dramatically alter the feel of your image. Pay attention to light and watch how it changes. And keep an eye on the histogram to ensure that you're leaving the scene with good exposures. With practice, in time you will be filled with complete confidence when faced with a difficult scene. And in the end, you'll have gained a much better understanding of when and how to take great pictures.